We've all heard the dire warning, we only have one planet and it's in peril. But what can we do today to impact the environment we pass on to the next generation? This week, conversations with environmental activists who are taking on the fight for our planet's future, from the seafloor to the world's highest summits and every terrain in between. I'm Mike Walter, coming to you from the heart of New York City's vibrant Times Square. Let's take it full frame. Our oceans cover about 70% of the Earth's surface. They're beautiful, mysterious, and home to one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. Unfortunately, due to pollution generated mostly on land, their health and viability is in danger. One legendary family has explored the depths of the sea and fought to combat the threats to the world's oceans for 3 generations. Like his father and grandfather before him, Philippe Cousteau Jr. is a gifted storyteller and a television host, author, environmentalist, and social entrepreneur. Continuing his family's legacy in 2000, he co-founded Earth Echo International. He's made it his life's work to educate and inspire young people around the globe to take action to restore and protect the future of our oceans. I recently sat down with Philippe at the 2015 Aspen Ideas Festival to talk about the most dire threats to our oceans and the far-reaching impact of his family's life work. I've watched a lot of interviews with you, and it seems like every conversation starts the same way, talking about your grandfather and your dad. And I'm wondering, is that an honorable legacy, or at some point you say, God, they cast such a long shadow. Why don't people talk just about me?
Not at all, because, we are all products of our histories. And I don't consider my father, grandfather, that legacy at all a burden. Far from it. It's something that has inspired me and inspires many people, and I'm proud of it. And I particularly like to talk about my father because, he died 6 months before I was born, back in 1979, which might as well be 1,000 years ago in popular culture. And so I like to remind people of the incredible work that he did as well.
My father died when I was young. Dissimilar to you in the sense that at least I knew him and I idealized him. And I think if I were to talk to somebody who knew my father, they'd say, yeah, your dad had his flaws too. What about somebody like yourself? I mean, did you spend a lot of time in search of your father, trying to find out more about your father?
I was fortunate twofold. One, having an amazing mother who raised my sister and I. She continues to be the most important person in the world to me, and really kept my father alive for us. We were fortunate in that for most people, I think, who lose a parent, they may have a couple photographs, maybe a home movie, and that's it. But I have all the documentaries. My father was my grandfather's right hand. They filmed and produced 26 of the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau together. My father was the producer, the director, the chief filmmaker, director of photography for those films. He did his own series called Oasis in Space that won multiple awards. He wrote a book with my grandfather. So he left a pretty robust body of work that I was able to, and continue to be able to, go back to and watch. And then my mother, of course, raising us with just wonderful stories, and all the people that he knew and loved him, the crew, et cetera, that I've grown up knowing, really provided insight. Nothing like the real thing, of course, but I think I've been fortunate in that way, that I've had a larger body of work of his that I could see and touch and feel and understand, rather than I think most people that tragically lose their parents when they're young that don't have that.
When did you first say to yourself, I'm going to go into the family business?
There was no pressure to do conservation necessarily, or oceans, or anything like that. And it was really the soft sell, I think, in that my mother gave me the opportunity when I was 16 to go on an expedition with an amazing woman who's tragically recently passed away, Dr. Eugenie Clark, who was one of the great female oceanographers of the 20th century, and one of the first and greatest. And I went to Papua New Guinea for 2 weeks with her doing research, and this was really the first time that I'd ever gone in the field and had that kind of scientific expedition experience. And I was blown away by the adventure. And just remember my mother always telling me that my father always said adventure is where you lead a full life. And I thought to myself, here we have an opportunity to travel and do research and see cultures. I almost died twice while I was on this trip, once from disease and once from other people. We went up to the highlands in these remote place with, hooly wig men who were living in grass huts. I mean, this was just a whole new revelation for me. And I thought to myself, God, if you can make a living doing this, why would you do anything else?
There are some who might say, I almost died twice. It's a good reason not to do it.
That's true. However, I like to think that when we are close to and living those kinds of very real, rich experiences that may be life-threatening to a certain degree, it just reminds us how short life is, how precious life is, and how we should live it to the fullest. So I tend to go the other way from that perspective, as opposed to retreating and thinking, oh my goodness, we need to, I need to be as safe as possible and, board myself up in a house and not venture out into the world. Quite the opposite. I feel like we need to go out into the world, explore these things, because life is short no matter what. My father spent years traveling around the world in some of the craziest places in the world, doing some of the craziest things. And it was a landing gear in an airplane that malfunctioned that caused the airplane to crash. I was with Steve Irwin when he died. We were filming a documentary together, and this was another really reminder of this. He was an amazing guy, and it was really a freak accident that tragically took his life. Of all the crazy things 3 days earlier, we were wrestling a 17-foot saltwater crocodile. Not just the two of us, there were 10 of us, but doing all these really amazing, kind of many would say scary things, diving with great white sharks, etc. And it was just a freak accident with a stingray that took his life. And so both of those experiences really reminded me that life is short and precious no matter what we do. And be careful, be responsible, be respectful of nature and the world and people, but don't shy away from taking calculated risks, because that's where you live your greatest life.
You talked about how precious life is, and we're sitting here. You can hear the water there in the distance, the birds chirping. It's just a beautiful place.
It's fabulous.
And it brings to mind how precious this planet is. And I want to ask you about the sense of urgency you have. I mean, your grandfather and your dad, great storytellers, but it didn't seem like the planet was in peril to the degree it is today. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me about that and how that drives you?
My grandfather grew up in the south of France, very modest means. He was born on a kitchen table in a little downstairs apartment in Saint-André-Cubsec, which is a town in Bordeaux. And he always dreamed of flying, actually, going up. And it was actually a car accident where he broke his back. He had enrolled in the French Navy to join the naval aviation program. And he had a car accident, broke his back, and tragically was washed out of the naval aviation program. I like to call it the most fortuitous car accident in history, because everybody that was in his naval aviation class were killed in the early days of World War II. So I literally would not be here if it wasn't for that car accident. My father was born afterwards. And diving then, or he was told to swim in the Mediterranean every day to rebuild his strength, and given a pair of goggles by his captain. So he started free diving and exploring this world that he knew nothing about, and became frustrated with this idea that he could only spend 2 or 3 minutes, as long as his lungs could hold air, underwater. And if anything, people think of my grandfather, they think of a legacy of conservation, of exploration, of a visionary. Ted Turner called him the grandfather of the environmental movement. But I think of him as a problem solver, first and foremost. That's the Cousteau legacy in my view. Because because of his frustration of limitation at time you could spend underwater, he met an engineer, and they tinkered, and they co-invented the aqualung to be able to swim freely, scuba dive for the first time in history. Then he wanted to share those stories with the world, so he took cameras and tinkered with them and made them waterproof so that he could bring them underwater and film. And we have things like The Silent World that came from that, which was the first time the world had ever really seen what it looked like underwater. And so every step along the way, my grandfather was really just trying to solve problems that presented themselves to him. And at first, it wasn't about conservation. And this is a really important lesson for me growing up when I realized this. At first, it was just about exploration. It was about exploring this world. There wasn't a sense of conservation of the oceans. All we really knew was what we pulled out in fish and what we dumped in trash. It wasn't until maybe 20 years later, in the 60s, that my father and grandfather were on an expedition in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, visiting some of the old haunts that they hadn't been to in a long time. They were so struck by the decline of the health of those environments that they came back from that expedition and said, it's no longer about just exploration. This stuff is disappearing. These worlds are, before our very eyes, dying, and we have to do something about it. And if I look at my grandfather and his work, the urgency grew as time grew. The greatest destruction of our environment in general is all post-war, post-World War II. The industrialization of our planet and of the oceans really occurred post-World War II, just in a relatively short period of time. And also, we also have to remember that when my grandfather was born in 1910, there were 1.6 billion people on this planet, the population of India. And so, in his lifetime, he died in 1997, we got to about 6.5 billion. So he witnessed a growth that is staggering in and of itself, and is something that the human species has never had to deal with, this kind of large global systematic problems. We've dealt with war and famine and disease on localized individual, relatively short-term periods. But now we're dealing with too many people in the bank vault. How do we tackle that problem? And so we have so much more technology and information that we didn't have back then. That's really, every time we learn something new, we're realizing, oh my God, it's worse than we thought. NASA, all of NASA's predictions about the shrinking of the sea ice were too conservative. Everybody's predictions. Because no one really knew actually how thick the sea ice was. They all estimated it was thicker than it was. They just knew the width because of satellites. So now we're starting to understand the thickness and how that varies of sea ice. And so the sea ice has shrunk faster than anybody predicted. So all of our predictions have largely been too conservative. And the technology that we have access to now that we didn't even have 10 years ago is really exciting, because it's giving us a perspective and understanding about our planet that we couldn't have dreamed of when my grandfather was alive.
You mentioned, how do we tackle this problem? And you and your mother and sister have Earth Echo International, which I guess is one phase of that. Can you tell our audience what it's all about, how it came to fruition, why it's important?
I really started to focus on environmental education and really recognizing that, as a friend once told me, if we don't have a youth strategy, we don't have a strategy at all. Challenging myself, how do we grow the constituency of people that care about these issues so that we can stop fighting these political battles and move on to the solutions? And that's what I've dedicated Earth Echo to do. Every great social movement, from women's suffrage to civil rights, has been driven by younger generations. These kinds of revolutions weren't driven by seniors. They were driven by younger people. And so why aren't we focusing on a generation now that can drive the same kind of change from an environmental perspective that we need? And it's been a really amazing experience, because every single time that I start to get depressed about the state of the world, it'll be in Nepal or in Africa or wherever we are, all I have to do is go into a classroom or an auditorium or work with young people, and the passion and enthusiasm that they have, the unwillingness to give up, to concede defeat, inspires me. So I like to think I actually get a lot more out of working with young people than they get from working with us, because it's what keeps me going and keeps me inspired. It's very hard to change the worldview of an adult. And I remind people, I've never seen a 30-second public service announcement or looked at a billboard that a lot of my colleagues spent a lot of money investing in the nonprofit space, that completely changed my worldview. A 30-second PSA calling climate change a hoax. I never saw one that said, you're right. So we are so focused in cramming our perspective down the throats of adults, in many cases very difficult thing to do, behavioral change, behavioral modification of adults. The old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. While you can to a certain degree, you get a much bigger return on investment when you focus on young people, because they're already there. They're much more willing to look at the world in new ways, to adopt new ideas, that makes sense, to be driven by science and common sense than adults are, largely in society. And so what's very interesting about that as well is that young people have a tremendous then influence on their parents. I've never had an adult come up to me and say, you know, I didn't think conservation was important, and I didn't care about the oceans, and I believed climate change wasn't real, and I saw a documentary and it completely changed my mind. I have had many come up to me and say, you know what, we watched something with a family, with our kids. Then they came back from school and they said, Mom, Dad, we need to start recycling. We need renewable energy. We need to think about the food that we're eating and the clothes that we're wearing. You know, then they change their behavior. And so when you invest in young people, you get a double return on investment. You help build the kind of citizens that we want to run this world, to build the world that we want in the future. And you also have a whole army of young people that are influencing adults in a way that we, as nonprofits, could never hope to do.
Well, and the other thing that I think is fascinating, I mean, I've watched some of the videos. You can watch any video now, YouTube. You can. You got these young kids in Anacostia who are collecting trash. You've got the Chesapeake Bay. You've got. It's not just taking them out and introducing them. It's what you experienced when you went on that trip. You know, they're immersed in it, and suddenly science isn't in a textbook. It's real, and that's how you get the passion too, isn't it?
We need to stop training kids to be robots, to fill in little circles on a piece of paper, and start to help them understand that things like science, going outdoors makes it come alive. That science is nothing more than poking something with a stick and seeing what happens. It's about adventure. It's about understanding the world and exploring the world and answering questions. And so we seek to make science in the classroom come alive by going on expeditions, exploring these issues. When you get kids outdoors and you show them that they can change their community, that they can clean up their river, they can pass a law, they can do remarkable things, all of a sudden you light a spark and they understand that they can change the world. And that's the key. Because we want people to grow up, we want young people to go out into the world with a passion to see problems that exist and say, you know what, I'm not just going to stand by passively and take that. I have the power to change it.
I remember years ago I read this book by Stephen King called The Dead Zone, and it was pretty frightening. I was looking through the research, and you talk about the dead zone. I don't know which one's more frightening now. Describe the dead zone for people and the importance of this.
So dead zones are a result of nutrients in the water that cause hypoxia or anoxia, and that means low or no oxygen. And so all the animals that are in those bodies of water, fish and crabs and animals that breathe oxygen, just like you and I do, suffocate if they can't swim away. And so there's a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, the size larger than the state of New Jersey, largely due to agricultural runoff from agriculture in the United States. There are dead zones, there's over 400 of them around the world. And they're a very big, significant problem because a lot of these coastal habitats, the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana being a great example, are traditionally very rich in seafood. And seafood is a very important source of protein for a lot of people in the world. And so you start to recognize, again, on these systems, cause and effect. Maybe we have cheap agriculture and cheap meat because we dump all the waste into the rivers and the lakes and lock the animals and feed them all these antibiotics, but there are consequences for those actions. And so all that junk ends up down in rivers, causing dead zones, which then put fishermen out of work and impact the economy in other ways and make people sick. So, there's cause and effect, and we need to start understanding that it's not just looking at what happens locally and regionally, but understanding the long-term consequences. And that's what Artheco is really all about. Our name is all about understanding that all of our choices have an echo on the world, that reverberates of each other and comes back and affects us. And that's, I think, the big challenge, is to get people to think more from a systems perspective and more communally than very independently, and it's all about me and what I can squeeze out of the system.
So action, reaction, as global citizens, what can we do on a daily basis to improve things, enhance things?
I believe it starts at home. It starts with recognizing that all of our choices have consequences. Thinking about our food habits, balancing our diet, eating more grains, fruits, and vegetables. For example, in the United States, we eat, according to the FDA, far too many meat products for our health. and that we need to balance our diet a little bit better. When we look at the clothes that we wear, the fashion industry is the second largest polluter in the world, second only to fossil fuels. Most people don't know that. So when we buy fast fashion and cheap clothes and $5 t-shirts, they're cheap because they're destroying the environmental and human capital that was needed to create them. So we need to be thinking about the clothes that we wear and making conscious choices about that. And with the internet, there's so much information available about food, about clothing, about companies and brands. If we're fortunate enough to have investment portfolios, invest in stocks. I don't have a lot. I only invest a little bit in the investment fund that we launched. I don't make a lot on a nonprofit salary, but I still chose to invest that in our retirement fund in Give, in an impact investment portfolio that takes into consideration where it's investing money. So all of our choices, how we spend our money, how we spend our time, where we go on vacation, and crucially, who we vote for, is very important for us to build the kind of world that we want and for our children and that we deserve for ourselves.
Philippe, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.